Good morning. My name is Catherine Newcomer, and I am a faculty member in the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration at the George Washington University, and the proud co-host of our grants management breakfasts. We have been doing this for, I don't know, so over 3-4 years, and the topic of grants management is so critical to public servants at all levels of government that it was a very easy decision for our school to participate with REI in holding breakfasts on very critical topics. I wish we were at the George Washington University in the Marvin Center, like we always used to be, and had drinking our coffee and having our croissants or bagels or whatever. I miss those days. I'm sure we all do, but we'll get back to them. We will come back and have our coffee and breakfast together at some point. But for now, I'm delighted to share the hosting with Jeff Myers from REI Systems, and he is going to introduce our guest today on yet another extremely timely topic. So thank you for joining us. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and it's a pleasure to co-host with George Washington University and to work closely with you. For those of you who have not attended one of these before, the primary purpose of these breakfast forums is to create and strengthen a sense of community. And in fact, we find that there's a pretty big community around folks who are seeking grants, but there are not so many people focused kind of on how to improve the business of managing grants to a certain degree from the grantor perspective. And in fact, more than 20% of federal spending is through grants, where of course the federal government is fiscally responsible and wants to make sure that the mission is carried out. But the folks who are actually doing the work are close to the local beneficiaries and receive those grants and have to do the focus on kind of reporting, applying for the grants, receiving them, accounting for them, doing the reporting, and so forth. So the breakfast forum here is to try and help create an opportunity for people who got challenges or experienced successes to come and talk a little bit about what those are, so that others in the community can learn from them and also develop a network of where to turn and whom to turn to in case they do have a challenge or a problem or need some support or assistance. Just briefly, REI Systems provides a range of technology and business process support for grant-making organizations, as well as a number of grant-receiving organizations. We're particularly proud, especially in this time of the pandemic, that one of our largest clients, the Health Resources and Services Administration, didn't get a prize, but perhaps should have. They were able to institute a new grant program to sponsor or arrange and fund planning and emergency preparedness for COVID within 18 days after the passage of legislation until the first grant went out the door. And they weren't satisfied with that. With REI's assistance, we're proud that when the CARES Act was passed to provide funding for both testing as well as diagnosis and treatment of COVID to people who are disadvantaged and have difficulty accessing medical care throughout the United States, HRSA brought that number down to 12 days. 12 days after the CARES Act was passed, HRSA got money to the frontline health clinics throughout the country to provide that testing, diagnosis, and treatment for COVID. So we're really pleased to be part of the grant management community. And we thought, I want to kind of offer a little bit of an overview. We thought that this blockchain topic would be really interesting and important because there are some folks who, like me, don't really know what blockchain is, and others who don't know, how could it be potentially valuable in the grants community? And so the folks from MITRE that I'll introduce in a moment are going to kind of help describe that. But at a very simplistic level, which is about kind of my level of understanding, I think there are going to be kind of a couple of three potential benefits from blockchain. It may reduce dramatically the burden on people, for example, providing healthcare to manage, account for, and report back on their use of funds. It will make it much easier and allow them to spend much more of their time providing healthcare. And similarly, perhaps in the longer term, it will allow much easier reporting back of performance results and allow it to be much easier to be able to say, again, with the health example, which health clinics are getting the best outcomes so that we can learn a little bit about how they got those outcomes and share those lessons. The blockchain technology essentially will allow people to spend less time managing grants and with the administrivia and more time doing the work that the grant's purpose is to accomplish. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. First will be my colleague, Jason McGill from REI Systems. He's only been with REI Systems for about 1.5 years. Prior to that, he actually spent 10 years working within the Federal Department of Health and Human Services at the Grant Solutions, which is providing grant support for a wide range of federal agencies. He'll be accompanied by Jasmine Faubert and Marla Ozarowski from the MITRE Corporation. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, MITRE Corporation manages a number of what are called FFRDCs, federally funded research and developments programs. And they do so, for example, in this instance, on behalf of the Department of the Treasury with co-sponsors from the Social Security Administration and the Department of Veterans Affairs. And we're really pleased because REI is participating at MITRE's invitation on a pilot that cuts across both several federal agencies, a number of blockchain technology experts, and a number of grants management experts and technology firms such as REI. And what they're working to do is tell you a little bit about kind of some of their research so far, and a little bit about perhaps what they see next within a pilot process to be able to say, let's try out blockchain in a few instances and see whether or not it really achieves what we hope it can in the grants management arena. So we're going to be both hearing from them now and looking forward with great anticipation to the results of that pilot that takes place over roughly the next 12 months. So with that as the precursor, let me turn it over to Jason McGill. Jason, do you want to say a few words kind of about grants management in the federal space?
Oh, we certainly can. Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. Glad to have everybody together. And Kathy, I certainly echo your sentiments. It would be nice to be able to do this all in person soon enough. So, Jeff, you touched a little bit on blockchain, and I think one of the things that we've seen, the grants management space has kind of been sort of working around the edges with blockchain for a little while now. I think it's been a little bit hard to define or kind of put some boundaries around, hey, where do we think blockchain is really going to show its greatest success, and where does it have the most potential in terms of where it fits in life, and so on. And so, you know, there are a few ongoing or maybe parallel, I don't want to say competing, but certainly in parallel projects that are leveraging some extent of blockchain technology in some various components. The Treasury is working with NSF on some things, HHS is doing some things. And we've seen them, like I said, some are in pre-award, some are in post-award. I think what we're going to talk about today, well, what I know we're going to talk about today is MITRE's work kind of across the agencies and trying to look at all of the different things that they've gathered and start to talk about the data in terms of what this research could look like and where we could take this. And I think a lot of folks, they hear blockchain, they think Bitcoin, they think, oh, this is this weird cryptocurrency, and how does that have anything to do with grants? The technology itself, in my view, when we talk about grants management and what it could look like in the future, and I know far more about grants than blockchain, I'll tell you that. So, but I think done correctly in the award phase, you really could turn the issuance of NGAs into a transaction at a much greater level than it currently is. You could, with the ability of the technology applied correctly to virtually eliminate fraud, waste, and abuse. Obviously, Jeff, to some of your points with reducing grant recipient burden and so on, you might be able to get to a point where, because of how much control and how much oversight or insight really you have into that grant dollar and being able to track it from inception to award and knowing every stop that it makes along the way, we could really issue NGAs, we could save so much program admin dollars, start to focus on outcomes and goals, and really strengthen performance management at the back end. So that's kind of where we are. Those are my thoughts and musings. Obviously, the experts are here to talk a little bit more about their work and some of that research and where we see that going. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jasmine Faubert from MITRE. You have the floor, Jasmine.
Thank you. Thanks for having us today. We really appreciate it. We're very excited about this project. If you go to the next slide, we'll start to talk a little bit about how we got here. How do we know we're on the right track? When we, in 2018, MITRE, because we're a federally funded research and development center, that makes us, by the nature of our charter, that makes us a neutral party. MITRE does not build software, sell software. We don't run production systems. Our only clients are the federal government, and our mission is to help the federal government build its capabilities. In this particular case, we also looked beyond the federal government. We looked at the grants management ecosystem.
Seem to have a problem with Jasmine's technology for a moment. Well, hopefully she's able to reconnect. This is Jeff again. Let me say, we would prefer if folks with questions reserve them until after the presentation. And at that stage, you have a couple of options. You can either type them into the question box, or you can click the little hand, the raise hand icon, and then we can answer the questions as appropriate. And I wonder, Marla, whether or not you're either able to fill in, or we can give Jasmine a moment or so, I guess, to try and kind of reconnect.
We can do either or both.
I'll leave it up to you.
Looks like Jasmine's dropping off and getting back in right now. So I'll slow roll it and begin to talk about the slide here, and hopefully she'll rejoin us in a minute. So as Jasmine was saying, MITRE, as an operator of federally funded research and development centers, in addition to work that it does directly under our contract with the government agencies that for whom we operate our FFRDCs, we also do independent research that addresses larger, more strategic programs that could, or larger, more strategic issues and problems that could have an impact in the future. And under that premise, in fiscal year 2018, the government approached MITRE and asked us whether we would be interested and willing to conduct some independent research on the problem of grants management and looking at ways that new technologies might be able to address some of those overarching issues. And because I think we have an audience here that is very familiar with the overarching issues, this is something that I know REI and GWU have been surveying every year with the grants community, and it's well understood that right now the process that we have is burdensome. It's hard for the grant recipients to do their reporting. There's a lot of administration work, as you pointed out, Jeff, that we know is making it harder for grant-making entities in multiple tiers, as well as grant recipients, to focus on the services that the grant awards and the grant money is meant to support and enable, rather than, and instead they're focusing on some of these administration problems. And as you can see right now, we've got this picture that shows that it's kind of a web with all the different entities talking with each other separately. Let's go to the next slide. So a future state, of course, would be a smoother, less burdensome process, timely payments for grant recipients at all levels in multiple tier situations, and greater availability, transparency of information on what the money is being spent on and what outcomes and results come out of that money that's being spent. So we want to make everybody's life easier and focus more on outcomes. And in fact, that of course is what, under the President's management agenda, cap goal number 8 is all about, focusing on grants management, outcomes, better performance, better use of federal dollars. So what happened was, in the research study that we conducted in fiscal year 18, we interviewed a large number of various entities that are part of the ecosystem, including federal government agencies, state and local government, mid-tiers like universities, state and local government, obviously also mid-tier, and recipients like community-based organizations, as well as inspectors general, who need to focus on identifying where there may be fraud, waste, and abuse, as well as independent auditors that work with the community-based organizations. And the idea would be, in a future state, we would have a way for them all to appropriately look at all the information they need to be looking at in order to do their job and focus on those outcomes. Next slide, please. So this is the study that we did. And as I mentioned, we did interview a large number of people. We published this paper at the end of the fiscal year. It ended in fiscal year 19. That paper is available. And the most important items, here's Jasmine. Jasmine, would you like to pick up here? I just did the first 2 slides.
No, why don't you keep going, since I don't want to cover stuff you've already done.
No problem. So in our study, we were able to conclude a couple of things. Most importantly, one of the key tenets of the work that we do is we never start with the technology. Our focus is on what are the improvements that need to be made, and is there a way to leverage technology to make those improvements to result in those outcomes. And so the first conclusion was that we determined that yes, there could be improvements in the grants management process if there were the ability to modify that business operating model. And that's part of what we're baking into this continuation project here. The second major conclusion was that yes, that distributed ledger technology, which is the generic term for what most people call blockchain. Blockchain is actually one particular type of distributed ledger technology, or DLT. And that distributed ledger technologies, blockchain in particular, offers capabilities that are well suited to implementing this new modified future state business operating model. And so the recommendation at the end of the study was next steps could include and should include executing a demonstration project or a proof of concept to validate these ideas and the benefits, the potential benefits that could result from this work, and to explore additional changes and challenges and mitigation actions for risks. And the idea was that we saw that the federal agencies could have improved decision-making through improved transparency, quality, timeliness of information, grant recipients, reduced reporting burden, reduced redundant reporting to all the various entities, and more efficient payment for all the tiers of the grants, and that the public would have improved transparency. We know now USA Spending provides information that's useful for the public. There could be even more availability and transparency, quality of information, both on financial spending as well as performance, that could be made available across the federal government and could be used and understood by the public as well. And then lastly, as we mentioned, to the IG community, inspectors general would have a better way and more ability to identify fraud, waste, and abuse where it may be occurring. Next slide, please. So we did have a decision in MITRE to go forward with the demonstration project, and we began it last March. So we are calling this phase 1. In phase 1, which we're just now wrapping up, or we just wrapped up recently, what we did was we went back to the various participants who we interviewed in the original research study, and we also went out and brought in additional participants from across federal as well as state government, universities, community-based organizations. We worked again with the IGs, and we also brought in industry, both blockchain providers as well as grant management solution providers like REI, and professional associations like ACT-IAC and the National Academy for Public Administration, NAPA. And we worked with them to develop a number of work products, which are listed at the bottom of the slide. Specifically, we developed what we call a functional and technical definition that includes our objectives, our assumptions, our constraints by which we will define and measure the work that we do. We developed several user stories, business use cases, and the detailed steps in an information flow diagram for how to demonstrate those user stories. We defined the data elements and business rule specifications, and we developed a conceptual architecture that I'm going to show you momentarily. And one thing I want to emphasize here is that all of these work products were developed using the standard methodology under the Federal Integrated Business Framework that is specified in OMB Memorandum 1916. And so we built on those government-wide cross-agency grants management Federal Integrated Business Framework artifacts. Next slide, please. So here's the grants management life cycle as defined by the Federal Integrated Business Framework. You can see They're numbered. They go roughly in terms of the grants management life cycle, starting at the top left-hand side, GRM 010, Grant Program Administration, going through pre-award management, award management, post-award management, and on the right side, grant program oversight. And you can see at the bottom, there's an overarching set of functions and activities we call grant recipient oversight that includes both indirect cost rate negotiation as well as grant recipient single audit. Many of you are familiar with the fact that any grant recipient that incurs expenses of over $750,000 of federal money in its fiscal year is required to submit to the federal government a single audit. And that's a part of the overall life cycle. So what I want to point out is that the dark blue functions and activities that you can see, GRM 30, the chevrons GRM 30 and 40, grant award management and post-award management, in addition to the single audit, those are the functions and activities that are part of the scope of our demonstration project going forward. So I'll show you in a minute that in our demonstration use cases, we're going to start at the point that the award is issued, whether it's a discretionary or non-discretionary award. Our demonstration project starts at the point of award and goes all the way through award closeout. Couple of other items I want to point out to you. As you can see, and Jeff alluded to this earlier, there are other initiatives relating to grants management and blockchain going on currently in the federal government. And you can see these as the call out. There's two of them below, GRM 20, grant pre-award management. In particular, National Science Foundation is doing a blockchain research project to look into how they can share information, look at grant applications across agencies to see where there's similar work going on that may be useful to be aware of. And HHS is also doing a blockchain project where they're focusing on pre-award applicant risk evaluation. And then lastly, you may have also heard, this is under GRM 30, Grant Award Management, in the center of the slide. The Treasury has been doing blockchain research work to determine the possibility of tokenizing grant payment, grant value. So we heard earlier that, yeah, when you think about blockchain, everybody goes, oh, that's Bitcoin. We're not going to be using any type of tokenization of dollars in our project, but indeed the Treasury is looking at that possibility. What would it take to tokenize value and actually have a recipient be able to cash in their tokens as they're doing their work? We'll, however, use the ordinary traditional way of dispersing funds in our demonstration project. But the dark blue on this slide shows you the scope of the grants management lifecycle that will be in our demonstration project. Next slide, please. So I mentioned a moment ago that in order for us to achieve the desired outcomes and in order to be able to leverage a technology like blockchain in order to achieve those outcomes, we need to have a modified operating model. And this is actually one of the steps for one of our use cases. In this case, we have a discretionary multi-tier award with a reimbursement payment. We also have a use case we'll be demonstrating with an advance payment. For the purpose of this example, we show a federal agency identifying an award to a university and issuing the award agreement. The steps that are in light blue are all the current process steps that would be involved in this, but I'd like to point out the highlighted steps in dark blue are the ones where we would propose changes to the existing process, steps 6 and 11 and 15. And what you'll see there in those changes is that the federal government would now, in this proposed new future state model, only give out the amount of money to the entities that will be actually using that money to deliver their services. So in the case of the university having an award and then issuing subawards, the payment from the government would go to the university for the amount of money that it would be spending on its part of the award. And then as it issues subawards, the amounts of money that go to those subawards would be issued directly to them. The second major change is that there would be transparency through all the different tiers of the award to all the information that's flowing from the federal agency down through the first tier recipient and its subaward recipients. Next slide, please. So this is the conceptual architecture that I mentioned a moment ago that was developed as part of our phase 1 of the demonstration project. On the left, you'll see a bunch of text that actually talks about what are the characteristics of the grants management ecosystem and why does a blockchain distributed ledger technology match those characteristics. And basically, grants management is a decentralized set of business processes that may be managed autonomously by a lot of different entities, federal, state, local government, tribal entities, universities, community-based organizations, and there are different regulations, policies, and procedures that they have to adhere to. And award information, financial performance information are actually assets that we would all say they need to be able to have timely and accurate access to as they process, as they go through execute the grants management business process. Blockchain technology matches that type of operating model where you can have decentralized management of what they call blockchain nodes or systems, and that aligns to the decentralized business processes where entities can determine what information, how much information is appropriate to share with the other entities. Another trait or characteristic of blockchain is that once a transaction gets posted to the ledger, the blockchain ledger, it's immutable. So you have the ability to have digitally signed tamper-resistant transactions that show the history of all the processes, all the transactions. And as well, you can scale up and down the blockchain ecosystem solution as grant recipients and grant-making entities enter and leave the ecosystem. So let's take a look at the conceptual architecture on the right. In the center of the slide, you can see there's a dark blue box with a white box inside it. No, the one in the center of the slide, go over to the left. Thank you. Yes, that is our blockchain environment. And that is where we'll actually see the little cubes there represent the blockchain nodes. Behind them, you can see the different colored disks that constitute the information repositories. And in the center, that is where we have our grants information. And it's all the information that would be needed to process the awards, the payment requests, the approvals, the reports, etc. And although they don't need to be centralized, they are virtually centralized in a way that whomever needs access to the appropriate information can access that information as though it were in a centralized repository. If you look over to the right, you can see the various entities that are involved with the transactions. You can see the orange icon is the federal grant making agencies. In the middle, you can see the middle tier, for example, state and local government would be there, universities would be there, and then to the right, sub-tier, sub-award tiers, the community-based organizations and other entities that may be delivering services. All of them will have access to the blockchain environment in a way that works for them. And in particular, if you can look, there's a set of services inside the dark blue part of the box, and that includes user interface services. That would be for smaller entities that may not have grants management solutions, that may be doing their books in QuickBooks or Excel or whatever. They would be able to have a web-based interface into the environment. whereas larger entities, federal government entities, state government entities, large universities, they would have system-to-system interfaces into the blockchain. They would be using solutions like REI's solutions. And in fact, we're delighted, as was mentioned, that they're going to be participating in our demonstration project. The other thing I wanted to mention here is if you look at the top of the dark blue box, you can see there's an icon with a $sign, and that would be the payment interface. We're also delighted that HHS's Program Support Center is interested in participating with us, and they'll be testing their services that would actually take the payment requests and determine the appropriateness and issue those payment requests, the disbursement of funds to the federal treasury, which is that light green arrow at the top. I mentioned earlier that we're not going to be tokenizing funds, but rather once a payment request is approved, the instructions to disperse funds would be issued to the federal treasury and would be done through the traditional direct deposit ACH transfer. The last thing I want to talk about, actually there's two more things I want to talk about on this slide. You can see we've got two boxes, the dark blue box in the center of the slide and then the lighter blue box on the right side of the slide. In between those two boxes, you can see there's another set of users, stakeholders, that would include the independent auditors who have to conduct independent audits for the larger recipients, as I mentioned earlier, as well as the inspectors general, who have indicated that they would see a lot of value in their ability to look across the ecosystem to be able to identify patterns that may be irregular in their interest, to identify where there may be cases of fraud or abuse. The way that we actually enable information to get looked at in an analytics capacity is at the bottom of the dark blue box. You can see there's kind of a funnel with things going into it. That's our information filtering service. And what will happen is that there will be a service that will take the available information, the appropriate information that's shareable, so that wouldn't be considered confidential or sensitive or personal. And that information would be filtered from the blockchain and the information repository and put out to multiple reporting and analytics capabilities, which will be part of our demonstration project. And the idea there would be ways for various stakeholders to be able to look at that information, look for patterns of best practices, performance improvement opportunities, compare and contrast where money's getting spent and how the outcomes are coming out. And so we've heard from many of our stakeholders that this is one of the most important pieces of the capability that we'll be demonstrating, that will allow them to really look at performance, results, and outcomes and be able to fine tune and improve that over time, a continuous improvement process. Next slide, please. So we spoke already about phase one, the work that we completed in the last 8 months or so. And this is where we are now. On the right side of the slide, you'll see phase two. It's just now getting off to its start, and we'll be running this for the next year. Phase two will be consisting of 2 work streams. In the middle, you can see the solution development, demonstration, and evaluation. This is where we'll be assembling teams of grants management lifecycle solution providers, blockchain technology providers, payment processing service providers, and we'll be working with various grant management user experts, people who understand the work of grants management. And together, these teams will be developing the proof of concept of demonstrating the end-to-end business use cases with this future operating model. In addition, separate from the technology piece, one of the key things that we found in the research project 2 years ago was that even with the best of technologies and the most streamlined business processes, there are still certain challenges that would need to be addressed as part of the adoption in order for this future state operating model and underlying technology to be successful. And so in parallel this year, as we as our teams develop the proof of concept and the demonstrations, we'll also be assembling 5 working groups or solution adoption working groups to look at the key problems that were identified or the key challenges that were identified in the research project that would need to be addressed in order to successfully deploy. And so we'll be working with groups that have expertise in public-private partnerships, funding, cost-sharing and revenue models, regulations at the federal and state, organizational change and transformation, and the use of data, security and privacy, and we'll be addressing some of these challenges. There are 5 in particular. What would a future state governance model look like? What would a future state economic model look like? How would this be funded? How would people be paid? How would the operations be supported? The third area would be regulations and policy. What would need to change, if anything? How would we address those changes? The fourth one is organizational and workforce impact. Anytime you have major changes in systems, processes, capabilities, of course, we need to look at how does that impact the workforce, the people who are involved in managing these operations and executing them. And then lastly, now that we have an environment with greater transparency, what's the appropriate use of data by the public and by the various stakeholders? How do we make sure that the right data is made available to the right people, nothing more and nothing less, so that we actually are achieving our outcomes? So with that, we can go to the next slide. That's the end of our formal presentation. We'd be happy to address questions at this point.
So this is Jeff again. Let me emphasize, you can type your question into the question box, or you can raise your hand and one of us will call on you. Just to get things started, first, I find this really exciting, and well, we have a question. Can we get a copy of the slideshow? And the answer to that is yes. We will send that out with a thank you note to everyone who attended, and that will also include, of course, the contact information for our presenters. Let me ask a specific question, though. I mean, this again, I read between the lines and find it very exciting. I think about real problems like, you know, I submitted my grant application, Ms. Grantor, and you tell me you lost it. And so my thinking is that the blockchain technology will help make transparent, you know, when it was submitted, where it was submitted, who it was submitted to, and perhaps there will be no more lost applications. Or the reverse, you know what? We sent you the money and you tell us you didn't get it. Let us show you where and how it was gotten and how much and so forth. So I guess I'm kind of wondering whether or not, you know, are there any other sort of real concrete problems that are in the presence of mind for a grantor or a grantee that you hope this will solve?
Do you want to take that one, Jasmine?
Yeah, Ashley, if you would go back to the slide with the grants life cycle on it. One of the things that I want to clarify is that for our purposes, for the scope of our presentation, for the scope of our project right now, where we're starting in the life cycle is at the award phase. And I'm sorry, I'm not seeing the presentation at this point, so I'm just going to speak to it. In the part of the life cycle
Actually,
phase,
we don't see the presentation slides.
Apologies, my computer's being funky. It should be on right now.
Thanks.
okay, great. Thank you so much, Ashley. So one thing, just to clarify, for the purposes of this demonstration project, we are focusing on a grant award management and grant post-award management and grant recipient oversight, the ones in dark blue. Now, to answer though Jeff's point, if we are successful in proving what we think is true about the utility of blockchain to more readily share information, there's no reason that earlier parts of the life cycle couldn't be incorporated. So you see under grant pre-award management, what Jeff brought up about grant application support and receipt and grant application review and selection. The information that Marla showed you, we were focusing on to collect in the blockchain could be expanded to include grant opportunity and grant application information. For the purposes of our demonstration project, we're not including it, but in the future it certainly could be included. In the other example that Jeff brought up, you can see it does cover the ability for a grant recipient, no matter where they are in the tiers of grant making, to submit in a payment request, and then to have that payment request be reviewed by the entity that awarded them the grant, and then have that information immediately be available to the payment processing service. So in the case of Jeff, that is part of what we will be demonstrating in the project, is how expediently can we complete the process of a grant recipient putting in their request, if it needs to be approved and reviewed, and then off to payment service as quickly as possible.
Great. We have a question from audience member John Stevens, who says, have you projected how much trapped value could be released by implementing changes?
Say again, how much trapped value could be?
I can kind of fake it in. Could be released by implementing these changes. Essentially, kind of what value will they produce? I can kind of fake it for a moment, which is the annual grant survey that George Washington University and REI Systems undertake found that across the spectrum of both grantors and grantees, an estimated 40% of grant managers' time was spent on compliance issues. I don't know for certain, but of course we're not talking about eliminating all of that. I would hope that that could be cut by, a factor of maybe 25% or more. And so we're not talking about, if you make $100 million in grants, we're not talking about, 25 million. What we're talking about is the administrative burden on that. Another factor that came out of our survey was that the administrative burden ranges between about 8 and 12% for most agencies, actually surprisingly, regardless of whether they're recipients or grantors. So if your agency makes 100 million in grants, let's pretend you have $10 million worth of administrative costs, and the other piece of the survey estimates 40% of that, or $4 million, is, $10 million worth of grants costs. $4 million of that is kind of administrative compliance. And if you were to take my estimate, $1 million, 25% savings might be possible. It's certainly not 4 million. It's probably not, zero. But for a $100 million grant making organization, I can imagine easily, $1 to $2 million might be a plausible estimate. And again, I'll stand behind that with my life. It's an absolutely confident estimate. Not really.
So let me mention one thing, is that part of what we're going to be doing when we are, one of the things, being a federally funded research development center and engineers that we are, one of the things we will be doing is the participants who participate in our phase 2 part of the project, one of the things we will be doing is working with them to try to capture the answer to that question, to get them to, once they see the solution, once they have a chance to use the solution, once we have a chance to demonstrate the solution with all the participants, we will be asking the participants of phase 2 to help us start to collect some metrics on what do they see would be the difference between what they have to do today and what it would be like if this was fully implemented. So hopefully we will have an answer to that question based on demonstration and metrics by the end of phase 2.
Just as an aside, Kathy Newcomer, this might be a fantastic PhD topic for one of your graduate students at the Trachtenberg School. We have another question from Pamela Arnold, who says, can you elaborate on how an interested party might be able to participate in the next phase? And the question, I think, is, whether it be a grant recipient who's on the line now, or whether it be a grantor, can they still join in? And I'll add to that, how will it be possible for folks to learn about the results of this as they go along?
I can take that. Yeah, we are absolutely still accepting interested parties who would like to be part of the teams for one or both the actual demonstration proof of concept work itself, as well as the solution adoption challenge working groups. And our contact information is included in the slide deck, which will be distributed after the meeting. And if there's anybody interested in getting more information and possibly participating with us, we'd be more than happy to speak with you about it.
Also, I just want to add, we are pretty flexible. There's a range of participation based on the amount of time and resources you have to contribute. As Marla said, it could be as simple as joining in some of the adoption workshops, which are a couple of hours over a couple of weeks. And it could also be as all the way on the other extreme of actually working with some of the teams that are developing the user web interfaces, developing the connections to solutions, and helping design the user interfaces. And we have a range of ability to participate in between those two extremes. So if anyone has any interest at all in participating, please contact us. And we've been pretty much able to tailor the participation to the available time and resources of the party that wants to join in.
Great. And I'll make an off-the-cuff offer here now, which I suspect that MITRE and Jasmine and Marla might match, which is REI sends out a newsletter regularly, typically about every 2 months. And we'll include information kind of on an update about what's going on with that project in this newsletter. What we typically do is if you register for one of these breakfast forums and we send you the newsletter, you're welcome to unsubscribe if you like, but we'll push the information out so you don't even have to think about it if you're interested. And I wonder whether or not Marla or Jasmine, is there a way that someone could either sign up or opt in or find a place to check on the status of the project, the implementation or the pilot project through MITRE if they would like to do so?
Yeah, let us know if you're interested and we'd be happy to talk to you. And we will be planning to send out communications on a regular basis during the course of the project on how things are going. And also at the end of this project, we will be once again publishing a paper for distribution on the results of the project, lessons learned, and hopefully then give all of our team members and interested stakeholders the ability to move forward with our learnings.
So I usually do this in person. I'm going to try it on a virtual format. I don't know if it'll work. I noticed one of the attendees is a gentleman named Tim Soltis, who actually oversees the OMB's Office of Federal Financial Management, which kind of helps set and organize policy government-wide. I'm going to cold call Tim. And Tim, you can unmute yourself if you like, or you can remain silent and pretend I didn't ask the question if you prefer. But the question is, I've heard that there may be some changes in the president's management agenda and potentially CAP goals. I wonder whether or not there's anything that will affect or either encourage or discourage or set guidelines for use potentially of blockchain, again, or other topics closely related perhaps that will help reduce the burden on the grant management process, either on the grantee side or the grantor side. And I'm going to try and unmute you now, Tim, while you think about that, if you are still on and willing to answer it. So Tim, you are self-muted. I tried to unmute you. So if you would like to join, you would have to unmute yourself, Tim. Doesn't seem to be happening. Okay, so we'll hold that. We have a question, or at least a raised hand from Crutchfeld. So I've unmuted you now. You can, at least I think I have. Now you're self-muted, Zula. Are you able to unmute yourself and speak?
Please disregard. Thank you.
Okay, that was not a real raised hand. All right.
Correct.
Any other folks with questions? If not, I have one or two more. Okay, we already got the question from Pam Arnold. So again, kind of thinking pie in the sky and long term, a 5 or a 10-year horizon, I kind of think, hey, could this be the end of paper reporting? And maybe even kind of proactive reporting by a grant recipient, where I, as a grant recipient, have to sit down and type in my numbers or get my system to do it. Will this essentially kind of vacuum up the data that is required as part of the grant and send it off in separate formats, 3 separate formats to 3 separate grantors? Since, you know, let's pretend I'm a health clinic and I get some money from 3 different federal agencies and I've had to, you know, use different reporting formats and different reporting portals for all of them. Will in 5 years this blockchain thing solve that problem and essentially mean I no longer have to really worry about reporting?
Well, you'll still have to do some reporting. Ashley, if you would go back to the architecture picture for just a minute. What it will do, and a large part of what Jeff said is absolutely true. What this will do is reduce the need to report in different formats using different data elements and different information. The goal here is And this is why it's beautiful, because it links right into what the federal government is doing with standardizing the data elements, is that by standardizing the data elements, and then this architecture then lays on top of it a more standard way to communicate the information, to submit the information, those two things together, standardizing the data and creating a more standard way to provide the information, what Jeff is alluding to is a real possibility. And that's what we're going to be demonstrating in the proof of concept. Can we get away from email? Can we get away from paper reports? Can someone to a clinic that's at the receiving multiple grants, can they put their information in once and then it's distributed to all of the grant making entities that are part of the blockchain?
I think there's a really important message between your lines there, which is some people, I kind of was pretending to be one, think the technology is going to solve everything. But frankly, there's going to have to be some behavioral change and perhaps some policy change. And if we go with that example I just shared of, hey, I'm a grant recipient and I get grants from 3 different programs, 3 different agencies, there may need to be some coordination between those agencies. And it may or may not be that, one operating division of HHS will just automatically step up and cooperate with the Department of Veterans Affairs or with, FEMA. So there may be some need to kind of help encourage that cross-agency coordination. So the bottom line is the technology is not going to solve the problem entirely. And apparently, while I've been blathering on, Tim Soltis was not able to unmute, but has an answer to my question that he's typed in. He says, OMB is looking at updating the President's management agenda, and the focus is on accountability and transparency of grants, as well as an improved single audit process. This project fits squarely in addressing those challenges. So I think that's a very nice response from Tim, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get you on early. I'm sure it was my mistake. Do any other folks have questions, either with a raise of your hand or with typing them in? So I'm going to make kind of 2 quick announcements, and then I may have 1 or 2 more questions, or see if Marla or Jasmine have any other thoughts. My quick announcements are, I kind of hinted at a couple of the past results from some of our annual grants management survey. That survey is actually now open for response, and we'll include a link to be able to respond to it in the thank you note that we send you. It is co-sponsored by the George Washington University, the National Grants Management Association, and REI Systems. And as I say, kind of each year we have probably 90% of the same questions so we can track trends, and kind of 1 or 2 new questions each year. So in past years, for example, one of those questions was around grantee burden. A different year, one was around performance measures and data gathering and ability to evaluate performance. Another year, the question was around the administrative costs and the portion of costs that go to administration. So we have what we think are kind of the first good benchmarks based on the survey data. It's just a volunteer data. It's not a representational sample that's statistically valid. But nevertheless, we've now got information such as things like, if your agency is spending more than 20% of the value of its grants on administration, you're an outlier. And the average is typically between 8 to 12%. And on the other hand, we're trying, in fact, ourselves to do some research. There are some agencies that report spending only 2 to 5% of their grant value on administration. It's possible that they may be shortcutting things, but it's also possible they've got some real best practices that would be terrifically informative for others in the community. So I want to encourage you, if you have not already, to both respond to the grants management survey. The link will get you to within the next day, and also to share that link with your friends in the grants management community to make your voices heard. In fact, in past President's management agendas, the survey results have been included as an explicit reason, for example, to try and work as a presidential priority on reducing administrative burden. So your voice has influence through the survey. The second thing I want to mention is that we have a couple of kind of upcoming grants management breakfast forums. The dates are always dependent upon the availability of the presenters. One of them I'm really pleased with. It's going to kind of talk about how grants funding in education works up and down the spectrum. So we're going to have a representative, for example, the Deputy Superintendent of Education for the state of Utah, talking about being a grantor and a grantee. We're going to have a representative from a major public school system talking about being a grant recipient and service delivery provider. We're going to have a representative from the U.S. Department of Education. And just for fun, we're going to have a representative who does research on grant funding of K-12 education in European countries. And they'll each kind of talk about what are the couple of things that work best and what are the couple or 3 things that are kind of the most challenging that they'd like to see changes. So that will be one grants management breakfast. It'll be a panel discussion. Another one we'll have is that REI Systems has developed a kind of an artificial intelligence peer review tool that does machine learning. And it's actually something that's being implemented both in NASA and the National Science Foundation and the Office of Secretary of Defense. It's probably going to take 4 or 5 months before it's kind of been used enough that there's some real feedback, but we're going to ask one or several of those clients to come and talk about how they do peer review and some of the kind of the pros and cons of some of the artificial intelligence capabilities. So again, you know, it appeals to a different audience who are doing scientific research and doing competitive grants as opposed to block grants. The last one that we have upcoming, and I believe this one's going to be early next month, will be a representative of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, speaking about block grants and some particular efficiencies that they've achieved and some particular aspects of performance reporting that they've had experience with. So my hope is that you do join for some of those upcoming grants management breakfasts. I, at this stage, don't see any other questions, so let me just ask, first let me say thank you very much, Marla and Jasmine. We really appreciate both your instigating this important effort, and as well, you're sharing the status with us today. Are there any last things that you would like to say before I turn it over to Kathy Newcomer to kind of close us out?
Nothing. Thank you for having us. We appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much for joining us. It's again, I'm sorry we can't be in the same room, but it was still nice to learn on an early morning, learn things that I did not know. And thank you all for joining both George Washington University and REI in our breakfast. And I hope that I'll see you at other ones. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Marla.
Thank you all. And I think that concludes this Grants Management Breakfast Forum. Have a nice day.